April 4th, 1973. Governor Nelson Rockefeller stood before cameras and dignitaries in Lower Manhattan, declaring the World Trade Center's dedication ceremony marked a dream come true. Behind him rose two 110-story towers, each stretching 1,368 feet into the sky, the tallest buildings in the world. The project had consumed $900 million in public money, raised through Port Authority bonds and government backing. Speeches that day celebrated vision, progress, international commerce, and the triumph of American capitalism. But for Oscar Nadell and 800 other shopkeepers, the American dream had arrived in the form of a living nightmare. What nobody mentioned that day. Where those towers now stood, there had been Radio Row, 13 blocks of bustling electronics shops where technicians haggled over vacuum tubes, where entrepreneurs built businesses from nothing, where 30,000 people earned their living. All of it gone. 800 businesses destroyed, an entire neighborhood erased from the map. This is the story of how two brothers from America's most powerful family wielded government authority to demolish a thriving community for a project the private market didn't even want. What happened to Radio Row? Why did it take eminent domain, backroom deals, and interstate political maneuvering just to build office towers? The answer reveals how power actually works when wealth meets government authority, and what happens when the machinery of the state becomes a tool for private ambition. Let me tell you about the most powerful family in American history and how they destroyed an entire neighborhood to build an empire. The Rockefellers didn't just have money, they had something far more dangerous, the belief that they could reshape entire cities however they wanted. John D. Rockefeller Sr. built Standard Oil and became America's first billionaire. By the 1880s, he controlled 90% of all American oil. Think about that level of power. The government eventually had to break up his monopoly because one man controlled too much. But his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., understood something even more valuable than oil: legacy. Throughout the 1930s, right in the middle of the Great Depression while millions starved, he built Rockefeller Center, 22 acres in Midtown Manhattan. It wasn't just buildings, it was a statement of power. Their philosophy became the family motto: go big or go home. They called it catalytic bigness. One massive project could transform everything around it. And they were right. Now enter David Rockefeller, born 1915, the youngest son. Harvard economics degree, PhD from Chicago. You'd think he'd become a professor, right? Wrong. In 1946, he joined Chase Manhattan Bank. By 1960, he wasn't just working there, he was running it as chairman and CEO. One of the most powerful financial institutions in the world, and a Rockefeller was at the top. But David had a serious problem brewing. From his office window in Lower Manhattan's financial district, he watched his neighborhood slowly die. After World War II, something terrible was happening. Every major corporation was packing up and leaving, heading to Midtown, to Connecticut, to Westchester County, anywhere but downtown Manhattan. Why? The truth was simple and brutal. Lower Manhattan was old. The buildings dated back to the 1800s. Streets designed for horse-drawn carriages, not cars. No parking lots, no central air conditioning, slow elevators, cramped offices. Meanwhile, suburban office parks offered everything modern: space, parking, tax breaks, comfort. Property values were crashing, vacancy rates were climbing, the tax base was eroding. And here's the kicker. The Rockefeller family owned massive amounts of downtown real estate. They were watching their fortune depreciate in real time. In November 1955, David Rockefeller shocked everyone. Chase Manhattan would build a brand new 60-story headquarters right in the heart of dying downtown, just 1 block from Wall Street. First major construction since the Great Depression. The entire real estate world thought he'd lost his mind. Why invest in a sinking ship? But David was thinking bigger. 1 building wasn't enough. He needed a complete transformation. In 1956, he created something called the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association. Publicly, it sounded nice. Concerned business leaders trying to save their city. The reality? It was Rockefeller and a hand-picked group of wealthy property owners protecting their investments. Real estate developers, bank executives, corporate leaders, all with millions at stake in downtown. In October 1958, they released their master plan. Build a World Trade Center, a $250 million complex to centralize international commerce. The proposal called for wholesale clearance and redevelopment, fancy words for demolishing entire blocks. But here's the problem. Everyone saw coming. No private developer would touch this project. Too massive, too risky, too expensive. They needed to acquire dozens of properties, displace hundreds of businesses and residents. Impossible for normal business. They needed something beyond business. They needed governmental power without governmental accountability, the power to seize private property, the power to ignore local laws, the power to issue billions in bonds without voter approval. They needed the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And then, like a miracle, or maybe careful planning, something incredible happened. In January 1959, David's older brother Nelson Rockefeller became governor of New York. Read that again. David controlled the money, the banks, and the business coalition. Nelson controlled the state government. The Port Authority was their perfect weapon. Created in 1921, it answered only to the governors of New York and New Jersey. It had extraordinary powers, eminent domain, revenue bonds, exemption from local zoning. And it was run by Austin J. Tobin, an ambitious empire builder who'd spent decades constructing bridges, tunnels, and airports. By 1960, Tobin needed a new grand project to justify his agency's existence. Everything aligned perfectly. The Rockefeller vision, the Port Authority's unlimited power, political control, financial resources. The pieces were in place. The power structure was aligned. All that remained was selecting which neighborhood would be sacrificed for the Rockefeller brothers' grand vision. Before the Twin Towers, there was Radio Row, and I guarantee you've never heard this story. It's 1921, and a guy named Harry Schneck opens a tiny shop called City Radio on Cortlandt Street in Lower Manhattan. Just one shop selling radio parts. That's it. But something magical happened. As home radios exploded in popularity during the 1920s, more shops opened, then more, then hundreds more. By 1927, the New York Times was calling it Radio Row, 13 blocks of pure electronics paradise. Here's what made it special. Nobody planned it. No developer. No government program. No master blueprint. It just grew organically because the market demanded it. Radio repair shops, television technicians, electronics parts dealers, military surplus stores, all crammed together in 4- and 5-story buildings from the 1800s. By the 1960s, Radio Row had roughly 800 businesses. Not corporate chains, family-owned shops, many run by immigrants or first-generation Americans who started with just a few $100s. This was accessible entrepreneurship before that term even existed. And the numbers? 30,000 people worked there directly. Another 120,000 depended on Radio Row's economy indirectly. Annual sales in the tens of millions. Massive tax contributions to the city. But here's what really made Radio Row incredible. It was a living university. Before widespread electronics engineering programs existed, this is where you learned. Teenagers got hired as shop assistants and learned from master technicians. Old-timers taught young kids how circuits worked, how to repair radios, how to identify components. Each shop specialized in something different: marine radios, broadcasting equipment, specific components. Electronics enthusiasts traveled from across the entire northeastern United States just to visit Radio Row. Why? Because you could find anything. Discontinued vacuum tubes that manufacturers stopped making 20 years ago. Radio Row had them. Obscure components for prototype projects. Radio Row. Technical advice from someone who'd been doing this for 40 years. Radio Row. Students from nearby technical schools shopped there. Engineers from major corporations sourced materials there. Ham radio operators, broadcasting stations, inventors, tinkerers, everyone came to Radio Row, and the culture was beautiful. Shop owners competed with each other, sure, but they also helped each other. If you walked into one store looking for something they didn't have, the owner would send you to his competitor down the street who did. They shared information about new products, reliable suppliers, market conditions. Many owners had started as employees in other Radio Row shops, saved their money, and eventually opened their own stores. Kids inherited businesses from their parents. Regular customers were known by name. Credit was extended based on trust, not credit scores. It was a small village inside Manhattan, crowded, chaotic, vibrant, and absolutely essential to America's electronics industry. The buildings weren't fancy. Cheap utilitarian structures with plate glass windows, merchandise crammed onto shelves, spilling onto sidewalks. Upper floors had workshops and modest apartments. Nothing glamorous. But it worked perfectly for what it was. To the people who worked there, Radio Row was their livelihood, their community, their home. But to urban planners and David Rockefeller's associates evaluating Lower Manhattan in the late 1950s, Radio Row represented everything that needed to be cleared away. Old buildings, congested streets, small-scale businesses generating tax revenue, sure, but not projecting the image of a modern global city. David Rockefeller saw something different when he looked at Radio Row. He didn't see a thriving community of 30,000 workers. He didn't see the knowledge network that had taken 40 years to build. He didn't see the families who had invested their entire lives into these shops. He saw valuable real estate occupied by businesses that could be eliminated. He saw a blank canvas for his vision. He saw prime Manhattan property being wasted on small shops instead of generating maximum profit. Most importantly, he saw that he possessed the resources and connections to take it, and he was about to use them. Want to know how they actually did it? How the Rockefellers and the Port Authority destroyed an entire neighborhood? The shopkeepers began organizing almost immediately. They formed the Downtown West Businessmen's Association with Oscar Nadel as spokesman. They pooled money to hire lawyers. But the legal team delivered discouraging news. The Port Authority had broad authority to condemn property for public purposes. Courts historically deferred to government claims about public interest. The blight designation, however questionable, would be extremely difficult to challenge. The battle ahead would be David versus Goliath, except Goliath controlled the courts, the governors, and the definition of public purpose itself. Let's start with the numbers, because they tell you everything you need to know. In 1960, private developers looked at Lower Manhattan and reached the same conclusion: impossible. The acquisition costs alone for 13 blocks would run into tens of millions of dollars before any construction began. Then, you had environmental remediation, infrastructure upgrades, and foundation work in unstable landfill, each adding millions more to the bill. The construction itself? hundreds of millions for office towers tall enough to compete in Manhattan's market. But here's what made it truly absurd. There was no market. Companies weren't looking for new Manhattan office space. They were leaving for the suburbs. The whole proposition was financially unviable. No private entity would touch it. The risk was simply too great. So the question becomes, how did it happen? The Port Authority wasn't a typical government agency. It operated with unusual independence and extraordinary resources. Its funding came from revenue bonds backed by bridge and tunnel tolls, essentially a constant stream of capital. But what made it truly formidable were its legal exemptions. The Port Authority wasn't subject to New York City building codes, zoning regulations, or local oversight. It was a Bay State agency, controlled jointly by the governors of New York and New Jersey, which meant it operated largely beyond the reach of city politics. For Austin Tobin, the Port Authority's executive director, the World Trade Center represented something critical: institutional survival. Without major projects, the agency would lose its engineering talent and political relevance. The World Trade Center promised years of employment for Port Authority staff and enhanced prestige for the organization. It wasn't just a building project, it was the agency's future. The initial proposal placed the towers on the East River, near South Street Seaport. But New Jersey's Governor Robert Maynor had a simple question: what's in it for New Jersey? New Jersey happened to own a failing asset, the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad, known as the H&M. Ridership had collapsed from 113 million in 1927 to just 26 million by 1958, victim to the automobile age and the very tunnels and bridges the Port Authority operated. In December 1961, Austin Tobin met with New Jersey's newly elected Governor Richard Hughes and struck a deal. The Port Authority would assume control of the bankrupt railroad, rename it PATH, and in exchange, the World Trade Center would move to the west side, specifically to Hudson Terminal, where the railroad terminated, and where the Port Authority already owned property. It was elegant politics. Both governors got what they needed: jobs in both states, future tax revenue, and a solution to New Jersey's railroad problem. Radio Row simply happened to be in the way. Eminent domain requires the government to demonstrate both public purpose and that the targeted area is deficient or harmful to the community. This is where the designation of blight becomes crucial. The definition of blight proved remarkably elastic. It could mean structural disrepair, inadequate sanitation, or, most usefully, property that wasn't being put to its highest and best use. Radio Row's buildings dated from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They lacked central air conditioning and had small, slow lifts. The studies concluded they were obsolete for modern office space. Notice the phrasing: not obsolete full stop, but obsolete for modern office space. The businesses operating there didn't need modern office amenities. They needed affordable rent and proximity to each other. But the studies focused on what the buildings lacked, not whether those lacks mattered to the current occupants. The conclusion was effectively predetermined. Radio Row could be cleared for the greater good. The public interest justified the seizure. Yet these were functioning businesses, generating employment and tax revenue, serving a national market. The designation of blight was a legal mechanism, not an economic reality. 18th January 1964, the Port Authority and the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association held a joint press conference. They presented architectural renderings of twin 110-story towers, taller than any existing structure in the world. The estimated cost, $280 million. It would eventually exceed $900 million, but that revelation lay in the future. The narrative was compelling: transform the skyline, restore Lower Manhattan's economic vitality, promote international commerce. The press coverage was largely favorable. The New York Times praised the ambition. Editorials celebrated modernization and progress. The casualties received less attention. Approximately 800 small shops would be displaced, described as unfortunate but necessary. Job losses were reported vaguely as several thousand. No precise figures were established. The general tone suggested temporary disruption rather than permanent displacement. The location was revealed, the area bounded by VZ, Church, Liberty, and West Streets. Radio Row. The Port Authority never contacted the business owners in advance. They learned their fate from the morning newspapers. Oscar Nadell owned a radio parts shop on Cortlandt Street. His father had started the business. Oscar had run it for over 30 years. That morning, over his newspaper, he discovered his building was scheduled for demolition. His business would be forcibly relocated, and compensation would be determined by the very agency condemning his property. The government had decided he was in the way. The questions were immediate. Could the Port Authority actually do this? What legal rights existed? Could the condemnation be challenged? Where would they relocate? How much compensation would they receive? No one had answers. The shopkeepers organized quickly, forming the Downtown West Businessmen's Association with Oscar Nadell as their spokesman. They pooled resources to hire legal representation. The lawyer's assessment was discouraging. The Port Authority possessed broad authority to condemn property for public purposes. Courts historically deferred to government claims about public interest. The blight designation, however questionable, would be extremely difficult to challenge legally. The legal framework heavily favoured government action over individual property rights. Precedent after precedent had established that when the government claimed public purpose, courts rarely intervened. The battle ahead was profoundly unequal. The shopkeepers faced an opponent that controlled significant resources, enjoyed bi-state political backing, operated above city oversight, and worked within a legal system that traditionally sided with governmental authority. The legal deck was stacked. The political fix was in. The media narrative was already written. But the shopkeepers of Radio Row prepared to fight regardless. The shopkeepers didn't waste time. By late 1961 and early 1962, they'd formed the Downtown West Businessmen's Association. Oscar Nadell and Herb Siminoff from Leonard Radio took the lead, alongside other established merchants. The membership grew to over 300 shop owners and 100 residents, not just electronics dealers, but various small retailers whose livelihoods depended on Radio Row. They pooled what resources they could to hire lawyers. Their goals were clear: challenge the Port Authority's eminent domain powers, secure fair compensation, and delay or stop the project entirely. They also launched a public relations campaign. If the Port Authority could call Radio Row blighted, they'd show journalists the truth: functioning businesses with real customers, not urban decay. The lawyers found potential weak points, however narrow. The Port Authority's original mandate was transportation infrastructure: bridges, tunnels, ports, not office buildings. Could they legally build luxury towers for private corporations? Then there was the public purpose question. The government was taking private property from small business owners to benefit other private interests. Did that genuinely serve the public good? And the blight designation itself seemed questionable. These were profitable businesses generating tax revenue and employment. That didn't fit any standard definition of blight. It wasn't much, but it might provide grounds for legal action. At minimum, it could delay the project. The association invited reporters to tour Radio Row and see conditions for themselves. What journalists found contradicted the official narrative. Stores filled with customers, not abandonment. Proprietors who'd built businesses over decades, serving customers nationwide. Documentation showed 30,000 jobs, millions in annual sales, and substantial tax contributions. The narrative began to shift. Perhaps this wasn't simply progress replacing obsolescence. Perhaps powerful interests were destroying a viable community for private gain. Human interest stories emerged, families whose livelihoods spanned generations now facing elimination. Austin Tobin recognized the threat. Public sympathy could translate into political pressure. His counter-strategy was acceleration. Push for quick Port Authority Board approval, rapid property appraisals, immediate condemnation proceedings. The logic was simple. The faster the process moved, the less time for effective resistance and the less opportunity for political complications. In June 1962, the Downtown West Businessmen's Association organized a public protest march through Lower Manhattan. The centerpiece was a black-draped coffin carried through the streets. The inscription read, "Here lies Mr. Small Businessman. Don't let the Port Authority bury him." Hundreds participated. Merchants, property owners, residents, their families. A large crowd gathered despite the summer heat. Photographers documented the scene. Oscar Nadell addressed the crowd, calling out the injustice, pleading for intervention. It was effective political theatre. The abstract legal proceedings became human tragedy. Personal stories of life's work being destroyed, dreams being buried. In July 1962, the lawsuit was filed, challenging the Port Authority's right to condemn Radio Row properties. The arguments: public purpose requirements weren't met, the blight designation was false, the displacement was unjustified. The Port Authority countered that the World Trade Center would house international trade organizations and government agencies, promoting commerce and economic development that would benefit the entire region. The case worked through New York's court system, and as the lawyers had warned, judges proved historically reluctant to second-guess government planning decisions. In March 1963, New York's Court of Appeals, the state's highest court, ruled in favor of the Port Authority. The court accepted the government's argument that promoting international trade served a legitimate public interest. The blight designation went largely unchallenged. The fundamental objection, that government was taking private property to benefit other private interests, was dismissed. State legal options were exhausted. The business owners sought U.S. Supreme Court review. In November 1963, the Supreme Court declined to hear the case. The final legal barrier had been removed. The Port Authority could proceed with property appraisals and forced sales. Port Authority assessors toured Radio Row properties, conducting valuations based on structures, land, and projected business income. The results were devastating. A building purchased decades earlier for $20,000 might be appraised at $30,000. Inflation, replacement costs, business goodwill, customer relationships, location value, largely ignored. Relocation costs, finding new space, moving inventory, rebuilding clientele barely factored into calculations. Oscar Nadell's radio shop was appraised at a fraction of its actual worth. The shop had generated family-supporting income for decades. Moving would cost more than the compensation offered. Many owners were in their 50s and 60s. Starting over wasn't realistic. The Port Authority offered a standard $3,000 relocation payment per business, regardless of how long established or how prosperous. It wouldn't cover relocation costs, let alone replace decades of built goodwill. Owners requested higher appraisals, longer timelines, relocation assistance. The Port Authority made minimal adjustments and insisted on a rapid timeline. The economic reality became unavoidable. Legal avenues were exhausted. Political pressure had failed. Continued resistance meant losing businesses with even less compensation. By 1964, some owners began accepting settlements. They had no choice. Going out of business sales followed. Proprietors liquidated inventory at pennies on the dollar. Some relocated to other Manhattan areas, but the clustering effect couldn't be recreated. Scattered across the city, they lost the advantage of proximity that had made Radio Row work. Others simply retired, taking inadequate compensation rather than face rebuilding. A few holdouts refused settlements, forcing the Port Authority into formal condemnation proceedings. If they couldn't save Radio Row, they'd at least impose maximum delay and cost on the project. By 1965, the outcome was certain. Demolition would begin within months. Radio Row would cease to exist. What the Rockefellers had planned in private meetings would rise on ground cleared through government power, wielded on behalf of private interests. The wrecking crews were coming, and this time there would be no funeral. Only silence. On 21st March 1966, Ajax Wrecking and Lumber Company began demolition. 6 buildings on Day Street went first. The strategy was systematic: work east to west across the district toward the Hudson River. The Port Authority wanted speed. Every month of delay meant continued costs and political risk. Buildings that had stood for 70 or 80 years disappeared in days. Crews broke through roofs, knocked down walls, hauled debris to New Jersey landfills. Photographs from the period show men in suits standing on pavements, staring at rubble piles that had been their businesses. Some former owners came to witness the destruction of their life's work. Others stayed away, unable to bear seeing it. Not everyone vacated willingly. A handful of proprietors refused settlements and ignored condemnation orders. They remained in their shops, serving customers, maintaining the fiction that normal business could continue. The Port Authority secured court orders for physical removal. City marshals delivered eviction notices. The holdouts were given hours to remove their possessions. In April 1966, marshals knocked on Oscar Nadell's door. He had 2 hours to remove what he could carry. He filled boxes with inventory representing 33 years of accumulated knowledge, suppliers, manufacturers, customers. Most had to be left behind. No time to pack everything. No place to store it all. The business he'd inherited from his father, expanded over decades, was reduced to whatever fit in a car. Within a week, his building was rubble. 30,000 direct jobs were lost when employers were forced out. The Port Authority paid settlements to property owners and primary operators, not employees. Workers lost their jobs and had to find new work in an economy already shedding manufacturing and technical positions. Those who followed relocated businesses found them operating on tighter margins with higher rents, unable to afford the same staff levels. The ripple effects spread. Mortgages couldn't be paid. Children's education was disrupted. Retirements were delayed or abandoned. African American and immigrant communities were hit hardest. Radio Row had been one of the few places where technical skills mattered more than surname or skin color. Shop owners hired based on ability to repair electronics, knowledge of components. The informal apprenticeship system that created skilled technicians was eliminated. Young technicians could no longer move shop to shop, learning specializations, building reputations. The demolished remains of 800 buildings created a massive waste problem. Hauling to New Jersey landfills would cost millions and take months. The Port Authority's solution: dump the rubble into the Hudson River along the western edge of the construction site. Brick, concrete, wood, glass. Everything was pushed into the water. Approximately 23 acres of new land were created, extending Manhattan's shoreline westward. Battery Park City would eventually be built on this Radio Row debris. The neighborhood destroyed to build the World Trade Center literally became the foundation for another development. Environmental regulations didn't exist in the 1960s. Critics raised concerns about water quality and marine life. Their objections were dismissed. Progress required expedience. The rubble had to go somewhere, and the river was convenient. By December 1966, most structures were gone. 13 blocks stood empty except for debris piles. Crews picked through wreckage recovering valuable materials. Steel beams were cut apart and sold for scrap. Architectural details were destroyed or lost. No preservation effort was made. The Port Authority conducted no archaeological survey. No comprehensive record exists of what Radio Row looked like in its final years. Few photographers captured demolition images, and those that exist are scattered and incomplete. Media coverage shifted to focus on construction beginning, not community ending. Radio Row appeared only as a necessary clearing operation, if mentioned at all. The Port Authority needed a prestigious architect with an international reputation to lend credibility to their controversial project. On 20th of September 1962, they announced Minoru Yamasaki as lead architect, with Emery Roth and Sons as associates. Yamasaki was born in Seattle in 1912 to immigrant parents who ran a small business. He earned his architecture degree from the University of Washington, supporting himself through part-time work, then moved to New York. When World War II came, Executive Order 9066 authorized the removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Yamasaki's parents were sent to internment camps. They lost everything they'd built. Yamasaki avoided internment only because he was already living in New York. But he'd witnessed his parents lose their life's work because the government decided their presence was inconvenient. The cruel irony, he was now designing the ultimate symbol of American capitalism on land, seized from small business owners through government force. Yamasaki believed buildings should emphasize light, openness, and human scale. His previous work featured delicate details, natural materials, and careful attention to how people use spaces. The World Trade Center program contradicted these principles entirely. The requirements were predetermined: 2 towers, 110 stories each, with floor plates large enough for massive office layouts. The scale contradicted everything Yamasaki believed about humane architecture. He accepted the commission anyway. It was the largest architectural project in the world. Turning it down would be professional suicide. The rationalization. Every architect makes compromises. This was simply a larger compromise for a larger fee. Over 100 design concepts were explored. The final decision: Twin Towers, 110 stories tall, to meet the Port Authority's requirement for 10 million square feet of office space. Buildings this tall faced enormous wind loads. Traditional steel frames with exterior curtain walls wouldn't work. The solution was a tube structure, closely spaced vertical aluminium columns on the facade carrying structural loads. The columns were 18 inches wide, positioned 22 inches apart. The visual effect created a dense, vertical rhythm, making the towers look wrapped in metal fabric. Yamasaki claimed he was afraid of heights, and the closely spaced columns made windows feel smaller, less vertiginous. The reality: engineering necessity presented as aesthetic and psychological choice. The windows couldn't open, standard for modern towers requiring climate control. Workers would be entirely dependent on mechanical systems, sealed in hermetic boxes with no fresh air. 50,000 workers in each tower. Traditional lift systems couldn't serve 110 floors efficiently, so a sky lobby system was developed. Express lifts to the 44th and 78th floor lobbies, then transfer to local lifts. It was technically impressive but alienating. identical floors stacked on top of each other. No control over temperature or air. Thousands trapped if building systems failed. Yamasaki's public statements discussed aesthetic refinements, careful proportions, the play of light on aluminium. What he never acknowledged publicly, the buildings were constructed on land seized from unwilling sellers. The promotional narrative showed well-dressed executives in pleasant offices with dramatic views. Radio Row's destruction went unmentioned in all Yamasaki's interviews and writings. The foundation needed to reach bedrock 70 feet below street level. The problem? Bedrock lay beneath layers of soil and fill accumulated over centuries, and the Hudson River was just 300 feet to the west. Traditional excavation was impossible. Digging a massive pit near the river would allow water seepage. The site would flood. The solution was the slurry wall, a technique used in Europe but never at this scale in the United States. The method: dig a trench around the perimeter, filling it with bentonite clay and water mixture as excavation proceeded. The slurry was dense enough to prevent the trench walls from collapsing. Once the trench reached bedrock, workers lowered steel reinforcement cages into the slurry and pumped in concrete. The concrete displaced the slurry, creating a permanent underground barrier, 3 feet thick, extending 70 feet down. A waterproof barrier around the entire 16-acre site, holding back the Hudson River. They called it the bathtub. Once complete, the interior could be safely excavated, and the wall would form part of the permanent foundation. Groundbreaking occurred on August 5, 1966, though demolition had begun in March. Approximately 1.2 million cubic yards of soil and rock were removed. All excavated material was hauled to the Hudson River waterfront. Bulldozers pushed the excavation debris into the water alongside the demolished buildings from Radio Row. Battery Park City would eventually be built on this combined rubble. Slurry wall construction began in early 1967. Specialized European equipment was brought in. The wall was excavated in 20-foot sections. Slow, precise work. Any mistake could compromise the wall's integrity and doom the entire project. By late 1968, a massive pit surrounded by slurry walls exposed bedrock across 16 acres. Workers began pouring the concrete base to support the towers. Steel was produced at mills in the Pacific Northwest during the excavation period. The design departed from traditional skyscraper construction. Traditional methods used a steel frame with columns distributed throughout the building. The World Trade Center's innovation was the tube structure, closely spaced steel columns on the exterior walls carrying structural loads. This created column-free floor space inside for flexible office layouts. Each tower had 240 steel columns on its exterior. Prefabricated units joined 3 columns together, spanning 3 floors. Each unit weighed approximately 22 tons. The units were transported by rail from the West Coast, a journey that took weeks. Construction schedules depended entirely on steel deliveries. The first steel for the North Tower was erected in August 1968. The South Tower began construction 6 months later, in January 1969. The Port Authority staggered construction to spread costs and apply lessons from the first tower to the second. Ironworkers operated at extreme heights in all weather. Manhattan's position at the river confluence created unpredictable wind gusts. Safety equipment was primitive by later standards. In January 1970, Carl Koch, an ironworker, fell from the 44th floor. He was 36 years old. He left behind a wife and children. The Port Authority issued statements about safety protocols. Work continued the next day. Total fatalities are disputed. Port Authority records acknowledge some deaths, but likely undercounted. Workers who died days later in hospitals from injuries may not have been included. Estimates range from 6 to over a dozen construction workers killed. Each death represented a family destroyed, a skilled tradesman doing dangerous work for middle-class wages. These workers built towers that would make the Rockefellers and Port Authority proud. Some paid with their lives. The initial 1958 estimate was $280 million for the entire complex. The reality proved wildly optimistic. Foundation challenges were more expensive than anticipated. Steel prices increased. Labor costs exceeded projections. Custom engineering at every stage added expenses standard construction wouldn't incur. By 1971, projections reached approximately $600 million. The final cost at completion exceeded $900 million. The Port Authority absorbed overruns by issuing additional bonds backed by bridge and tunnel revenues. The escalating price tag created public criticism. Austin Tobin emphasized public benefits. The World Trade Center would house international trade organizations, promoting commerce, government agency offices, and an observation deck attracting tourists. What was downplayed, the vast majority of space would be rented to private corporations at market rates. Public money was building private office space. Original completion was planned for 1972. The actual completion was pushed to 1973 due to weather, labor disputes, and the sheer complexity of building structures this tall. The first tenant was the Port Authority itself, which moved into the North Tower in December 1970. Self-occupation was both practical and symbolic, and revealed an uncomfortable truth. Outside tenants weren't rushing to sign leases. The South Tower topped out in July 1971, reaching its full 110 stories. The North Tower had topped out a few months earlier. At 1,368 feet, the two towers surpassed the Empire State Building as the world's tallest. The official dedication occurred on April 4, 1973. Dignitaries gathered to celebrate. Governor Nelson Rockefeller gave speeches about vision and achievement. Port Authority commissioners spoke about progress and economic development. Minoru Yamasaki attended the ceremony. The narrative celebrated triumph, the tallest buildings in the world, an architectural achievement. What wasn't mentioned, Radio Row's destruction. 800 businesses eliminated, 30,000 jobs lost, families displaced. The uncomfortable parts were removed from the official story. The towers were complete. They were the tallest in the world. The dedication was triumphant. But beneath the celebration, an enormous problem was emerging. A problem that would haunt the World Trade Center for years and vindicate every critic who had opposed the project. Almost nobody wanted to rent space in David Rockefeller's towers. The Twin Towers created approximately 10 million square feet of office space, more than existed in many entire American cities. The problem, Lower Manhattan's office market was already oversupplied. Finding tenants to fill that space would be difficult. Finding tenants willing to pay premium rents for an unfashionable. In 1970s corporate New York Midtown was the center of prestige. Park Avenue, 6th Avenue, Madison Avenue. These were where major corporations wanted to be. Banks, law firms, and major corporations clustered in Midtown because their competitors and clients were there. The World Trade Center's location was isolated. Subway access was limited compared to Midtown. The neighborhood shut down after business hours. A dead zone. Few restaurants, no cultural attractions, minimal retail. Employees spent their days in a business district that felt abandoned once the markets closed. Port Authority studies had predicted strong demand from companies in international trade. The projections proved wildly optimistic. Companies engaged in global commerce saw no particular advantage to a building called World Trade Center. What corporations needed was good telecommunications, convenient transportation, and proximity to partners. Lower Manhattan offered none of these. By mid-1973, occupancy rates were dismal. The Port Authority itself occupied substantial space, effectively renting from itself to avoid the embarrassment of completely empty floors. New York state government leased multiple floors, a favor arranged by Governor Nelson Rockefeller. Government tenants accounted for a significant portion of occupied space. Private sector leasing was a catastrophic failure. Major corporations showed no interest. Estate agents struggled to book tours. The buildings that were supposed to restore Lower Manhattan's prestige were being rejected by the very companies they were meant to attract. The Port Authority had borrowed nearly $900 million to build the towers. Rental income needed to cover bond payments, but occupancy remained below 50% and was climbing slowly. Rental income fell far short of debt payments. The Port Authority diverted money from bridge and tunnel operations to cover losses. This was a political problem. The Port Authority was supposed to be self-sustaining. Bridge and tunnel tolls were meant to pay for bridge and tunnel maintenance, not subsidize empty office towers. Commuters were effectively subsidizing David Rockefeller's failed real estate speculation. Architectural publications questioned Yamasaki's design. The closely spaced columns were described as oppressive. Sealed windows made the buildings feel like vertical coffins. Dependence on mechanical ventilation created an unhealthy working environment. The plaza was windswept and unwelcoming. People avoided it. The towers weren't the iconic achievement anticipated. Critics nicknamed them Rockefeller's Folly and David and Nelson. The observation deck on the South Tower's 110th floor opened in December 1973. It was an immediate success. Spectacular views, substantial income from admissions, favorable media coverage. Windows on the World Restaurant on the North Tower's 107th floor was also popular. But tourist pounds couldn't compensate for empty office floors. What was needed were corporate tenants paying long-term rents. Those weren't materializing. The 1973 oil crisis sent energy prices soaring and triggered a recession. Corporations cut costs and deferred expansion plans. The last thing they wanted was expensive new office space in an inconvenient location. By 1975, New York City was sliding toward bankruptcy. Years of deficit spending, declining tax revenues, and generous union contracts had created an unsustainable financial situation. Banks refused additional credit. President Ford initially refused assistance, though emergency loans were eventually arranged. The austerity period was brutal. Service cuts, employee redundancies, deferred infrastructure maintenance, increased crime. Companies weren't expanding in New York, they were leaving. The suburban migration trend from the 1950s accelerated. The towers stood as monuments to an urban renewal vision the market was rejecting. David Rockefeller's personal credibility suffered from the World Trade Center's failure. He'd championed the project as the solution to Lower Manhattan's decline. What it became, a project that consumed $900 million, destroyed a functioning community, and produced half-empty towers draining the Port Authority. Rockefeller continued leading Chase Manhattan Bank, but his civic influence diminished. The failure undermined his credibility as an urban planning visionary. Critics who'd opposed Radio Row's demolition felt vindicated. Their warnings that destroying a viable community to build speculative office towers was bad policy had proven correct. Climate control consumed enormous energy. Lift systems required constant monitoring. Cleaning 10 million square feet required hundreds of workers full-time. With occupancy below 50%, rental income couldn't cover operating expenses, much less debt service. In the late 1970s, occupancy gradually began climbing, not through major corporate tenants, but smaller firms finding reduced rents attractive. Government agencies expanded their presence. Financial services firms that couldn't afford midtown addresses took World Trade Center floors at a discount. The buildings were finally filling, not with the prestigious international trade organizations that had justified the project, but with ordinary businesses making pragmatic cost decisions. By 1980, occupancy reached approximately 75%. The Port Authority was still using bridge and tunnel revenues to subsidize the towers, but losses decreased. Optimists suggested the towers might eventually break even. The observation deck continued attracting tourists. The towers were becoming a recognizable skyline element. Films set in New York featured them prominently. Popular culture was slowly transforming them from Rockefeller's folly to an accepted part of the urban landscape. But acceptance wasn't redemption. The towers existed because 800 small businesses had been destroyed. They'd been built with borrowed money and had taken a decade to generate anticipated revenues. The vision of Lower Manhattan renewal through prestige development had largely failed. Corporate headquarters continued clustering in Midtown. The Rockefeller family never publicly acknowledged the failures or the methods used. The towers were standing. They were filling. And they were beginning to serve a function nobody had anticipated. They were becoming symbols. Symbols of American capitalism. Symbols of New York itself. But the dark story of their origins was being buried beneath a new narrative. A narrative of triumph that would, within a few decades, become sacred. Through the 1980s, the towers evolved from failure to fixture to symbol. They were there, enormous, and gradually people stopped seeing them as mistakes. They became part of how New York presented itself to the world, visual shorthand for the city in photography and film. By the mid-1980s, occupancy reached 90%. The Port Authority was finally collecting enough rent to cover expenses and debt service. The financial disaster had been overcome through persistence and market adjustment. The tenant mix was financial services firms, law offices serving the financial industry, and government agencies. International trade organizations were present, but not dominant. These were ordinary office buildings, not the special trade center envisioned. To admirers, the towers represented ambition, achievement, and American economic power. Proof the United States could build taller than anywhere else. Evidence of what private enterprise and government cooperation could accomplish. To critics, they were monuments to corporate excess built on small business destruction. Evidence of government authority wielded to benefit the wealthy at the expense of ordinary people. Radio Row had been erased from physical existence, but the moral questions hadn't disappeared. On the 26th of February 1993, a truck bomb exploded in the underground car park beneath the North Tower. 6 people were killed, over 1,000 injured. Smoke filled the building. 50,000 workers evacuated down darkened stairwells. The tower's vulnerabilities were exposed. They were targets due to their symbolic status. Their height made evacuation difficult. Getting tens of thousands down 100 floors took hours. Security was enhanced. Vehicle access was restricted. Barriers installed. Millions spent hardening the complex. Experts gave assurances the towers were now safe. Life returned to normal. But a warning had been given. Through the 1990s, the World Trade Center achieved its original vision, 2 decades late. Occupancy remained above 90%. Rental income was strong and sustainable. The observation deck and windows on the world remained profitable attractions. Many New Yorkers developed an attachment to the towers despite their controversial origins. 50,000 people spent their days there, working with extraordinary views. The buildings became familiar and beloved. A generational shift occurred. People born after the towers opened had no memory of Radio Row. David Rockefeller was in his 80s. Nelson had died in 1979. The Downtown Lower Manhattan Association had dissolved. The historical mechanisms that had cleared Radio Row belonged to the past. By 2000, the World Trade Center had stood for 27 years. Annual revenues exceeded $100 million. Maintenance requirements were constant but manageable. The debt had been refinanced at lower rates. Financial viability was achieved. In July 2001, the Port Authority agreed to lease the Twin Towers to Larry Silverstein, a New York developer, for the equivalent of $3.2 billion over 99 years. At the time, over 99% of the 10.4 million square feet was occupied. 11th September 2001. On a clear morning, 50,000 people went to work in the towers. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower. At 9:03 a.m., 17 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower fell. Less than 2 hours from first impact to second collapse. Buildings that took 7 years to construct were gone in 102 minutes. 2,753 people died in the towers and on the ground. The attacks transformed the towers from controversial office buildings into hallowed memorial sites. Radio Row, the neighborhood destroyed to build them, became irrelevant to public discussion. The inadequate compensation paid to business owners disappeared from the narrative. The years of financial losses were forgotten. What mattered was the catastrophic loss of life. The site became a memorial. The footprints where the towers stood were preserved as reflecting pools. Names were inscribed on bronze panels surrounding the pools. Visitors come to mourn, remember, and pay respects. In 2014, One World Trade Center opened on part of the original site. At 1,776 feet, it's taller than the Twin Towers, designed to be resilient against attacks. The memorial materials make no mention of Radio Row. The 800 businesses destroyed have no plaque, no acknowledgement. Oscar Nadell and the shopkeepers are absent from the historical narrative. Their story is buried beneath the narrative of loss and remembrance. In 2017, David Rockefeller died at age 101. Obituaries praised his philanthropy and business leadership. The World Trade Center was mentioned as a major achievement. The methods used were not discussed. His memoirs, published decades earlier, defended the World Trade Center as successful urban renewal. What was minimized or omitted? The destroyed businesses, displaced workers, and years of financial losses. The core question remains: does government have the right to seize private property from functioning businesses to build speculative real estate for other private interests? The court said yes. The towers rose as a legal consequence. But there's a different question: whether the legal authority should have been exercised, not whether it could be. The towers stood for 28 years. They evolved from failure to fixture to beloved symbol. 11th September sanctified them in ways their builders never anticipated. The dark story of how they came to be was buried beneath the narrative of loss and remembrance. The Rockefeller empire that built them is gone. Radio Row is forgotten. The towers exist now only in photographs, memories, and reflecting pools. Questions about power. Who decides what cities become? Questions about process. When do the means justify the ends? Questions about remembrance. What stories get told? Which get buried? The reflection pools stand where Radio Row once thrived, where the Twin Towers once stood. The water falls endlessly into voids that can never be filled. The names of those who died on the 11th of September are carved in bronze, but there are no names for those whose community was destroyed so the towers could rise. History belongs to those with the power to tell it. But the truth remains in documents, in memories, in questions that won't go away. The stories we tell shape how we understand power, progress, and justice. Official histories often omit uncomfortable truths about how great things came to be. Radio Row's story reminds us that behind every massive project, there are people whose lives were disrupted, dreams destroyed, communities erased. This isn't an argument that the Twin Towers shouldn't have been built. It's an argument that we should remember the full cost. Not just pounds and steel, but the human cost of displacement. Oscar Nadell and 799 other business owners deserve to be remembered. 30,000 workers who lost their jobs deserve acknowledgement. The families whose lives were disrupted deserve recognition. Eminent domain is still used for economic development projects across America and beyond. Public-private partnerships still blur the lines between government power and private profit. Urban renewal still displaces communities in the name of progress. Radio Row's lessons remain relevant about how power works, whose interests get prioritized, what gets sacrificed in the name of vision. Questions to ask. When governments and wealthy interests align, who benefits? Who pays? What gets lost? This isn't just history. These patterns continue in cities worldwide. The difference now is that we can ask questions, demand accountability, and remember what gets erased. The Twin Towers are gone. Radio Row was gone decades before them, but the questions they raise about power, justice, and the cost of progress, those questions remain. And they demand answers we're still learning to give.